Well, we are pleased to welcome to What Are We Thinking? A trip into the right hemisphere of the human brain. One of the world's leading experts on that subject. Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a writer, a former Oxford literary scholar. His book, The Master and His Emissary, subtitled The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, is one of the most insightful, provocative books focusing on the advantages of the right hemisphere of our brain. He lives and will be speaking to us from the Isle of Skye off the coast of Scotland. He's a popular speaker worldwide, and his new website, highly recommended, iainmcgilchrist.com. Iain, good afternoon.
Very good to be with you, Doug. It is an afternoon here, you're right, yeah. By the way, the main thing we've launched recently is not iainmcgilchrist.com, but Channel McGilchrist, which is channelmcgilchrist.com.
Channelmcgilchrist.com, great.
Yeah.
So let's start with your description of the differences between the two hemispheres, because if any of the people viewing Google left, right hemisphere, the websites that come up really oversimplify it. The left hemisphere is analytical, the right is creative. It's much more interesting and complex than that. So why don't you start us off by giving us the distinctions you see between the two hemispheres?
Okay. Well, as you say, most of the stuff you'll find on the internet is just not right. It's not just crude. A lot of it's quite wrong. Clearly, there is an important evolutionary point in us having two entirely separate hemispheres. And one of them is focused on manipulating the environment. It's specialized in very narrow focus, precise attention to some little detail. Now, this enables us, for example, if we're a bird, to pick up a seed on a background of gravel accurately, quickly in front of a competitor, or to, chase prey. It's a lock on to a small thing that you want to get. Or it might be to pick up a twig and build a nest. But that's the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere, meantime, is doing the broad picture. It's seeing everything on both sides of the world, not just on the left or the right. And it sees things as never really wholly disconnected from the wholes they exist within, inevitably exist within. It sees a world which is connected. The left hemisphere sees a world that is fragmentary. The right hemisphere sees a world that is constantly changing and evolving. The left hemisphere, like a series of snapshots, sees entirely static images, if you can put it as images even. It tends to abstract the left hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere sees things in context. And my, is that important. As I learned when I was teaching literature and thinking about philosophy, context depends, makes the biggest difference of all and changes completely what you're dealing with. The left hemisphere tends to deal with quantity rather than quality. It tends to categorize, whereas the right hemisphere sees unique cases. The left hemisphere tends to see things as inanimate, and they don't do anything or move until we give them a push. Whereas the right hemisphere sees a sort of animate world in which everything is potentially interactive with everything else. And I suppose the really most important thing of all is that the left hemisphere sees representations and the right hemisphere sees things as they not even are present, but present, as they come into being for us. So we're so used to thinking in terms of representations that we think the representations we have in our head are the reality. But in fact, if we attend, and this is one thing that we can do with mindfulness, stop trying to put something in a box, stop trying to verbalize it, stop trying to pass a judgment on it. If you actually just are there and experience it as it comes into being for you, that is what I would call presencing, which of course is a term that Heidegger used. Whereas the left hemisphere is representing, i.e. literally after the fact, when it's no longer present, actually. It's making a picture and it's saying, this is my representation. So it's like a diagram in relation to the thing that the diagram refers to. It's like a map compared with the actual world that is mapped. So the left hemisphere does the map, the right hemisphere, the real full experience.
So if I listening carefully to that distinction, it brings us to the really provocative subtitle of your book, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Clearly, since the Italian Renaissance, what I think unfairly is called the Great Enlightenment was really a focus on the left hemisphere, you point out in your book, that it gave us great technology and great science, but it was so focused on material results that we never saw the forest for the trees. Welcome to climate change. Welcome to economic and psychological anxiety. So clearly, the modern civilization is based much more on left hemisphere thinking, correct, than right hemisphere thinking. So we've sort of bought into focusing on things and specific certain results at the expense of a bigger picture context and a greater understanding. And we now live in a world connected by a World Wide Web. It seems like a much needed shift is needed more to the right hemisphere of the brain.
Yes, you're right that in many ways you can characterize the Enlightenment, the 18th century movement of rationalism, as a kind of shift towards the left hemisphere. But at the time, I imagine if I'd been there, I'd have felt that that was actually quite a useful development. And it was, gave rise to many of the things that we value about our civilization and our way of life. But it's gone, as it tends to extremes. You see, the left hemisphere not seeing very much, thinks it sees everything. It's people who know very little who think they know it all. People who know more know that they know very little. And the left hemisphere is like some rather bumptious, second-rate but fairly bright administrator. And it misses almost everything in experience that cannot be schematized, turned into algorithms, and set down in black and white. Now, all the really important things in our lives, such as falling in love, having a relationship with the sacred or the divine, appreciating literature, music, painting, architecture, understanding one another so that we don't just put people into boxes, vilify them, and think of them as just a kind of plastic substitute for a real living person with all their complexities. You see, all that gets lost in the left hemisphere. It doesn't understand the importance of the implicit. And that's a very important point. I mean, think about this. Humor depends on the implicit. As soon as you explain it, it's dead. If you have to articulate too clearly in prose your views on God or on your loved one, they seem entirely inadequate. If you have to be explicit about many things, you lose the richness that can only be there when you're dealing with something that has a vast realm of the implicit underneath it. I began to realize that when I was in Oxford trying to help people understand poetry. Once you take the meaning in inverted commas out of a poem, in other words, you paraphrase it and take it out of context and make it explicit, it's just like nothing. It's like, what happened there? It's the un-Midas touch. Everything turns to shit.
To create an analogy, in my experience, I spent 10 years delightfully you're studying dreams with Dr. Jeremy Taylor, one of the great geniuses of dream interpretation. And typically, people will go to a dream dictionary and say, well, water refers to the emotions. Numbers relate to this or that. And it becomes almost like a dictionary analysis of a dream, which misses the whole big picture that if you dream of touching a tiger, you want to feel the enormous power of that tiger. You don't want to analyze it and say, well, a tiger means this. So it very much ties into how your frustration with teaching poetry and literature, I think.
Yes. Well, everything is like this. You can't make it out of a cookbook by putting two of these together and one of those, or looking it up in the index. And as you say, water equal. You've just actually misunderstood. And, I've dealt with this in relation to mental illness as a psychiatrist. So, for example, depression. You get these missives from central bureaucratic organizations about the way to treat the depressed patient. You know, who is this depressed patient? All I've seen is thousands and thousands of individuals. They're all depressed in quite different ways. If you applied the same treatment to them, you would be missing the point entirely. We can't deal in life with formulae. And unfortunately, we're now drifting into a world in which, through interaction on the internet with algorithms all the time in order to get anywhere, like find out what's in your bank or anything like that. I mean, everything reduces you to a machine in which you have to respond according to the yes or no boxes. And I always say, when presented with these things, there's no box for my opinion, which is like, well, it depends which day you ask me on and who is it that I'm discussing this with and in what context, you know. And by the way, there can be truth on both sides of a question. Wow, if only we could understand that nowadays.
Which reminds me of the great quote from Alfred North Whitehead, the great scientist, philosopher.
Yeah.
He said, the opposite of a true statement is a false statement. The opposite of a truth is another truth.
Exactly.
Which I don't think the left hemisphere would have a good time with. We're talking with Dr. Iain McGilchrist. He is a psychiatrist, a writer, a former Oxford literary scholar, the author of our favorite book on the right hemisphere of the brain, The Master and His Emissary, the divided brain in the making of the Western world. He has a new website. He's working on a new book we're going to be talking about. But I'd like to go back to one of my favorite provocative gadflies from the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan, who said, quote, our time is a time for crossing barriers, for erasing old categories, for probing around. Now, this was back in the 1960s, but to me, he's referring rather interesting to the corpus callosum, which as a neurologist, you're going to tell us a lot about. This is the, according to your book, the estimated 300 to 800 million fibers that divide the left and right hemisphere of our brains. And when McLuhan talks about a time for crossing barriers, for erasing old categories, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I get from your book that while the left hemisphere is brilliant at focusing, analyzing, taking things apart, it's very territorial, a very mammalian brain trait. And it's not as open to crossing barriers back to its master, the right hemisphere, for erasing old categories and thinking in new, larger perspectives. But then you tell us something rather that confuses me a little bit about nature. You say that the main purpose of a large number of the connections in the corpus callosum is actually to inhibit. In other words, to stop the other hemisphere interfering. And you introduce the phrase functional inhibition. Why did nature put this functional inhibition in our brains?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't want to skimp on the answer. To answer that last part first, my hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis only, but I think I don't know of a better competing one, is that we evolved these two ways of looking at the world to answer a question of survival, to respond to a dilemma that all living creatures face. And by the way, this asymmetry of the brain and separation is there in every brain we know. So it's not just us, it's not even in mammals, it's in amphibians, reptiles, it's in nematode worms, it's in insects, it's in the most ancient creature we know of, 700 million years old, a sea anemone, and it has an asymmetric neural network. That's the most ancient neural network that we know of in existence. So it's a very primary, or it is a primary element in the way in which we take in the world. And that is to resolve this problem that you need, as I say, to be able to pay highly focused attention at the same time as paying broad open attention. Because if you don't, while you're getting your prey, you'll become somebody else's, basically. I mean, that's putting it very crudely, but it's one of the big drivers. In order to survive, you need both to attend narrowly and broadly. Now, I was fascinated because everyone said, oh, don't go into the business of the hemispheres, when I was a relatively young researcher. And that's all been blown out of the water. None of that's right. Well, it's certainly true that the things that people used to say and still do on management sites on the internet are very far from true. But there must be something there because it's been preserved for so very long. And I just asked myself 3 questions. Why is the brain divided at all? You know, if it's there to make connections, why have a whopping great divide right down the middle of the brain? Secondly, if there's no real difference between the hemispheres and you just wanted to enlarge, why wouldn't you enlarge symmetrically? The skull is symmetrical, the box in which the brain lives, but the brain is not symmetrical. It's quite importantly asymmetrical. And people whose brains are not properly asymmetrical have many problems, including schizophrenia is one of them, as I researched in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins. So it's a very important thing. And finally, why is the band of fibers that you referred to, the corpus callosum, why is it largely inhibitory? Only 2% of neurons actually cross the corpus callosum. But at least half of what they're doing is saying to the other one, keep out of it, keep out of it. Now you may say, but if they're to work together, how does that, you express some puzzlement. But actually, in order to work well, you need both difference and togetherness. As I often say, it's not a good surgical team in which the surgeon and the scrub nurse try to do the same job. They need to know that they're both necessary, but they do completely different things. So it's very important that this crosstalk is there to facilitate the transmission of information in a functionally exciting way, but also in a functionally inhibiting way. Yes, you need to know this, but also keep out of it. I'm dealing with it. That's really the point. And I suppose that, we think that it must be great to have everything connected. Well, it would be a bit of a mess if everything was connected. And also it would be terrible if everything was separate. We need individuation, but within an overall union. And I believe that that's a very important principle for looking at living things and indeed at the cosmos in general, that we need the principle of division and the principle of union, but we need them to be unified. And the corpus callosum and the brain demonstrate this.
So let me try an analogy, because here in the 21st century, we have this amazing tool called the World Wide Web. And again, Google educators, most educators are pulling their hair out saying it's terrible. Kids are addicted to the screen. Their memory, their working memory is not as great as it used to be. And my answer is, well, what are we students forced to memorize? Basically, left hemisphere oriented textbooks determined by some administration. The World Wide Web opens up virtually all of human knowledge and wisdom. The problem is, going to your point about the need for inhibit, it can drive us crazy having access to all that information, because in addition to, I can Google Iain McGilchrist insights, but then I get hit by 42 advertisements. And I might also have to avoid all sorts of crazy stuff. So how does the World Wide Web, in a sense, is it an interesting and useful metaphor for how our brains work and how we might have to learn to collaborate better together as human beings?
Yes, it's a good question you raise. I don't think I'd want to push an analogy with the brain too far. For one thing, it doesn't have 2 hemispheres and a corpus callosum. For another, it's not conscious. But I think what you're pointing to is, yes, that we need selection. Otherwise, what we need to know is drowned in noise. But also what the web provides is rarely an understanding, unless it's in things like, I hope, this discussion, which may offer some glimpses of understanding. But most of what the internet provides is simply information and, of course, misinformation, which makes it very hard to know what it is you're dealing with. So we drown in the sea of information and misinformation. And even if we could get rid of the misinformation, the information on its own isn't enough for an understanding. Information can be stored in a computer, but the computer doesn't understand. It follows elaborate procedures put into it by a human being that does understand in order to simulate it as best as possible. And as you quite rightly point out, the other thing about it is that it's constantly interrupting us. The right hemisphere has sustained attention. The left hemisphere has fragmentary attention. So the left hemisphere is fixing on this, then that, then the other, and then says, oh, they're all different. I've got to somehow put them together. The right hemisphere is meanwhile sustaining a view of the whole and seeing how they're already related, that you don't need to relate them because they're all part of a bigger whole. So the right hemisphere, with its sustained attention, helps us do things like indulge in a longer conversation, not just sound bites. Read a book peacefully, slowly, taking it in, not just glossing over the surface, not trying to do 5 things at once. Nobody can do 5 things at once and do them very well, certainly if they involve understanding anything new. So yes, it's not the best medium, although I'm enormously grateful to it. I mean, I can't, I went in an earlier world, I couldn't have been doing this with you now, Doug. So there we are.
And certainly in terms of research, et cetera. This is, I want to stay on the subject of focus because I think we would agree, you can tell me if you don't, that our educational system that we grew up with, which is still pretty much prevalent, is primarily based on left hemisphere focus. You memorize material and then you regurgitate it on a test. I don't think much has changed since that. I go back to etymology, which is so important. The word education comes from the Latin to draw out. Exactly. Whereas to me, our left hemisphere oriented educational system stuffs in, says, this is the stuff you have to learn to regurgitate. How do we, I mean, even at the college level at Oxford, you got frustrated teaching literature and turned to medicine. What is it about our brain and the way our culture fosters this mania for focus when, if we look at Einstein or any great geniuses, it's more unfocused attention through which they arrive at their great insights?
All this is utterly fascinating, and I completely agree. I always say education is about getting something that's already latent in the person to flower and come forth, leading it out, as you say. It's not about shoveling stuff in, and then it comes out at the other end of the system, where a piece of paper certifies that you've had enough information shoveled into you. This is absolutely no form of education. Education is just as much about seeing connections as it is about breaking things down. We need to be able to analyze, no question. We need to be able to break things down and understand them and argue about them logically. But by the way, that's not something our educational system, by and large, now seems to help with. People, I find, are finding it very hard to have a logical conversation anymore. They take things that you say literally. They focus in too narrowly. And although reason is a great thing, and I don't want to knock it in any way, it's also true that we need to go beyond it in order to see things. Now, Pascal, great mathematician and philosopher, one of the greatest mathematical minds that ever lived, said, if reason doesn't understand that it has limits, then it really is a poor thing. And it comes back to what I was saying about the left hemisphere not knowing its own limitations. So we need that, but we need to be able to see shapes. And I've investigated in writing my new book the ways in which many scientists and mathematicians reached their conclusions and came to their discoveries. And hardly ever was it made by following a linear track, the scientific method and so forth. Even as greater scientists in the mainstream of the last century, George Gaylord Simpson, famous molecular biologist, said, most of these discoveries were not made by following the scientific method. They were often insights that came after great application in which a picture came together and one saw the whole shape, or Gestalt, as the Germans say, which is a word we don't really have a translation for. But that's what's required. And can I tell you about an experiment that was done in the 1960s? I think it's great. It was done by Christopher Alexander, who's an architect and philosopher. And he grouped little patterns of strips with black and white bars on those strips. And he gave a group of students at Radcliffe back in the 60s these to group in any way they liked. And there were two ways, effectively, they could be grouped. They could be grouped in a sort of serial way by seeing that that one follows that one, and, you know, and there was another way in which you could see, but you'd have to think rather more intuitively, that there were likenesses of the overall shapes in these pictures. And he hoped that more than half would see the picture, but 80% saw only the kind of serial analytic list. And he thought that was important because, as he pointed out, to understand embryology, the growth of a fetus, to understand astronomy, to see the growth of a spiral nebula, to understand the growth of a plant, you need this different kind of perception of pattern.
So let's see if we can focus in on how we, the folks watching us, how we can all tap into the right hemisphere of our brain. I've learned to do it through dream work, through intuition, through creative visualization. There are many ways in, but your experience is so interesting to me. It's so right hemisphere in your teaching experience, because you taught literature at Oxford, got frustrated with, if I understood you correctly in an interview, the materialist view of literature, and turned to medicine and neurology, including you spent time at Johns Hopkins as a fellow researcher. So you really saw both worlds, the literary, artistic world, and you've also excelled in the scientific world. Based on that, how do you recommend to us we start stimulating and encouraging that crossing of the barrier from the left to the right hemisphere to open up to larger, to what is sorely needed in this era of climate change and mass anxiety, is bigger context and bigger understanding? Give us some clues as to how you've done it and how we might better access that right hemisphere of our brain.
How I did it was that there were philosophical questions that I'd been asking myself since adolescence. And I found that what I was looking at led naturally into examining the mind-body question. And that meant doing medicine in order to do it in an embodied way, not just an abstract way in a seminar room without windows somewhere in Oxford. But what I think we need, first of all, and I know this from being a psychiatrist, is that it's no good telling people, you may know when you meet them the very first time, you need to do these things, but you can't tell them the first time because they haven't yet come to see what the problem is. So my effort in the years I've got left is to raise awareness of these two ways of looking at the world and to make us see how we're in hock to the left hemisphere's one, which really enables us only to become more powerful and richer. But that hasn't led to happiness. You know, the data shows that we're actually less happy than we were when we had less material affluence. There's more depression in our society as well, and more mental illness. So one of the ways we can do it is by thinking differently about education, that it's not just closing down minds, but opening them up. And that's not in an undisciplined way. That doesn't mean let it all hang out and everything goes. No, we need discipline, but we also need to help, as it were, the muscles of the brain that help us see the big picture and see the whole, as well as those that help us to take things apart. And I think there are daily practices that can help. I'm a great fan of mindfulness. And in my new book, I actually take a passage from a Buddhist monk who is often considered to be the greatest living expert on mindfulness meditation. And I take a passage of just a few lines, and I can point out over 20 things that he refers to in it, which you can, if you know what you know after reading my book about the differences between the two hemispheres, you can see that what's happening is that the right hemisphere is being invoked here. And indeed, fascinatingly, people who do mindfulness meditation and even other kinds of meditation show changes in the brain with growth of parts of the right hemisphere. and activity in areas of the right hemisphere. It's not quite as simple and straightforward as that. There are also changes in the left hemisphere. So I'm being quick and dirty here, but the full story will be available soon.
I think quick and dirty works well on this webinar.